Hello, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology Lesson 2.01. This is the first of two chapters that we're going to do on tissues. So we're going to cover three of the four tissues in this chapter, and we'll do the fourth tissue in the next chapter. Your format's a little bit different here. We're not using the dot cam. I'm trying a thing. So I preloaded a PowerPoint slide with the notes or a PowerPoint presentation. So your handout has these slides, and then what I'll do is as I click through, you'll be able to see the notes. Now there might be times now and then where I'll want to add something and I don't have it pre-written. I'll try to tip you guys off, say, hey, you might want to write that down. And I'll also try to give you some time after I bring a new note point up to let you write it down. All right, so what we have on our first page are samples of the four different categories of tissues. We have in our body, so we know our levels of organization. We go atom, molecule, macromolecule, organelle, cell. If I take two or three different kinds of special cells and I put them together and they work together with a function, they're called a tissue. So let's go ahead and click our first. The name of the first category, give you a second to write that down, is epithelial tissue. Epithelial. Epi means upon. Don't remember what thelial is, but all of these tissues lie on top. They're covering tissues. They provide a surface. They cover a surface, and they provide protection. The second category, which is actually the largest, is connective tissue. Connective, connective tissue. This is also the most diverse group, and it gets its own chapter. So chapter 3 is going to be connective tissue. This has things like fat, blood, bone, cartilage, very, very diverse tissues, but they all serve in some way to either connect physically, like to tie things together like tendons and ligaments, or to carry things, connect things like, so blood connects the nutrient needs of your heart to your fingers. So it can connect in more ways than one. And again, that's the next chapter. We have muscle. So in the bottom left here, I have, this is actually cardiac muscle. We have three categories of muscle. And we're going to look at that briefly in this chapter, but we'll do more on muscle later. We actually do 2 chapters over muscle. Finally, the fourth category of tissue is nerve or nervous. So some people write nervous, Nervous. And what we're looking at here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 individual nerve cells, and together they make up nervous tissue. Going back to function, muscle, hopefully you already kind of understand that muscle's about movement. Muscle's about getting something from here to there. Nervous is about communication. So our nervous tissue allows us to send electrical signals from the brain out into the body and then back up into the brain. And it keeps everything connected through a communication standpoint. Again, in this chapter, we'll be doing epithelial, muscle, and then I might have some nerve slides for you on a tissue practical, but that will be about it because we'll do much more with nerves later. All right, let's move on and start with epithelial. So epithelial tissue, over here to the left, I have 4 different types of epithelial tissue. On this slide, what's in red is epithelial, what's in blue is connective. This surface or this tissue here is epithelial, and this is something different. So, but you can see there's a lot of, it looks pretty diverse. Well, there's 4 main functions for epithelial tissue, and I'll give you a second here to write. The first function is protection. Every surface of your body is covered with an epithelial tissue, and a prime example of this is your skin. Your skin on the outside and on the inside, so if you take your finger and stick it inside your cheek, that epithelial tissue is a little bit different from what you have on the outside of your skin. but they are still all epithelial tissue. These are ducts, and the ducts are lined with tissue to protect the duct. This is your respiratory tract, and you can see this protects. It also has, these are cilia, they have a special function. The second function is secretion. All of our glands are epithelial tissue. So your salivary glands and your are epithelial tissue, and then the ducts, your salivary ducts, are lined with epithelial. Wow, these are actually kidney ducts. Your bladder. Oops, sorry, no, don't want to talk about the bladder. Okay, you don't have to label this here because it's a really tiny picture, and we're going to do more with this later. But if you can look at this area right here, this is a gland that secretes, and it's secreting stuff out the top. It's a little difficult to see. But every respiratory tract lining that you have has cilia. It also has cells that produce mucus. So this is an example of a gland that is secreting something, and it's secreting mucus. All right, absorption. And the example of that is the lining of your intestines. absorption, absorption. So when we study one of the tissues called simple columnar, we're going to see that it has special features that allow your intestines to absorb your nutrients better. And your entire digestive tract is lined with this one specific epithelial tissue, again, that promotes absorbing, and especially nutrients, waters, vitamins, minerals, all those good things. Transportation between cells. Well, how are we transporting between cells? Primarily with cilia. And on this tissue, I mentioned it before, you can see here, these are cilia. So what happens is, as I have debris that accumulates in my throat, the cilia sweep it up to the back of the throat, and then I get the urge to cough, and I can cough it up. But the cilia are passing that substance up the respiratory tract. Another example, I believe, is in the oviducts. You have a epithelial tissue that lines there, and it has cilia, and it carries the egg down the oviducts. So that's how we're transporting them. All right, where do we find epithelial tissue? Again, let's catch up your notes. So not only on the surface, so I have all of this is epithelial, but if I stuck my finger in the side of my cheek, that's epithelial. If I put my finger down my throat, that's epithelial. I can follow it all the way down my esophagus, through my stomach, the intestines. This is the inside of the bladder. Darn it, I hate when that. No, go away. So this is the bladder, and this is the lining of the bladder. And so the inside of the bladder is hollow, but the lining of it is epithelial. This is a duct in the kidney, and that duct is lined with epithelial tissue. So sometimes this epithelial tissue opens to the outside, the external environment, and sometimes it's in an inside body surface. The other place we'll find it is our glands. So my salivary glands, and most of my glands are made of epithelial tissue. There's some specialty tissues, but for the most part, it's all epithelial. Okay, well, what we find, and I'll let you again catch up. So we're going to talk about the characteristics. All the epithelial tissues, even though these look very different, they have characteristics that are in common. And the first characteristic they have is that they are packed really, really tightly. They're packed close together. If you look at these, there is no space in between these cells. If you look, they are just the black or nuclei, or on yours, the dark gray or nuclei, and it's a nucleus against a nucleus against a nucleus. Well, if you think about it, if this is for protection, if you're wearing chain mail, you don't want big holes in your chain mail. You want one link to be connected to the next, to be connected to the next. And so because the function of epithelial tissue is to protect, they're going to be packed closely together. There's a saying in anatomy, form follows function. The way something looks is based on what it does, or what it does is based on how it looks, vice versa. And that's very much the case here. The second characteristic of epithelial tissue, there are no blood vessels, none. We call that avascular. And I'll pause. If you remember, you've had the prefix A. You had it in both biology, if you had biology with me, and in anatomy, and it means without. And vasculo is vessels. So avascular translates to no blood vessels. Well, how in the world does that work? It turns out that in order to be avascular, you also have to have the third characteristic, which is thin. This is why. So it says behind thin, it allows diffusion. This is an epithelial tissue. This underneath it is a connective tissue. This is an epithelial tissue. This is a connective tissue. Epithelial, and underneath it is connective. It turns out an epithelial tissue always lies next to a connective tissue, and connective tissues have a lot of blood. So what happens is the items that we need, oxygen and nutrients from the blood, have to diffuse over into, from here to here, into this epithelial tissue, and the waste has to diffuse back out. If you had a really thick tissue, it couldn't diffuse, and so if your tissue was way out here and your blood supply was way back here, this tissue would die. So because there aren't any blood vessels, all epithelial tissues have to be very thin, or they don't survive because they have to absorb through diffusion what they need, and they have to send it back out. All right, the next characteristic is epithelial tissues divide quickly. Divide quickly. Turns out not every category of tissue divides quickly. In fact, nervous tissue doesn't divide at all. Once your nerves are formed and set, now they can repair themselves, but they don't undergo mitosis. We don't create new nerve cells. In your brain, we don't grow new nerve cells. Some muscle tissue can, so smooth muscle tissue can divide, but cardiac and striated, at least cardiac, doesn't make new cells. Well, not only does epithelial make new cells, it does it very quickly. And you know this if you've ever scraped your knee or gotten a bloody uh, a knee injury, or you hit your elbow, or like scraped your elbow, or bit down on a chip. This is my favorite, right? You're eating a chip, and it's a sharp chip, and it cuts the inside of your mouth. You know that you only have a couple of days of discomfort before that starts to fill in. Well, why is that? Because you broke the epithelial, you damaged the epithelial, and you have to be able to replace that quickly, because you don't want to leave a gap in your integument where bacteria can get in and cause an infection, or on your knee. So because epithelial is the only tissue that divides quickly, 80% of all cancers are epithelial. That's why, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of the chapter, but most cancers, you don't find them in nervous, you don't find them in muscle, you don't find them in connective. Now, there's some exceptions, but almost all cancers are epithelial tissue. All right, last but not least, epithelial tissue has a top and a bottom. And we have two terms here. We have basement membrane, and we have apical surface, APICAL. Again, I will let you catch up your notes. Well, hopefully you see right away basement sounds like bottom. And the basement membrane is the bottom of an epithelial tissue. It's what connects to the tissue layer below it, which is almost always a connective tissue. Apical surface faces the top, it's the top of the tissue. And it either is open to the air or the surface or the exterior, or it's open to an interior cavity called a lumen, L-U-M-E-N, and I'll give you some examples of that. So let's take this tissue. This black structure is my basement membrane. And this is an example of where I said you might want to add some notes. I don't have them pre-written. So everywhere you see one of these black rings, that's the basement membrane, and that's attaching this epithelial tissue to the surface below it. So this is attached to this. And by the way, are these tissues really blue and red and pink and purple? In order to see them under a microscope, we need to dye them. And so these tissues have been dyed. So basement membrane. This, whoops, shoot. Sorry. This is the apical surface. So this is the top. This is an apical surface. These are ducts in the kidney. And so we have this area in the middle. This opening in this duct would be called the lumen, L-U-M-E-N. And I don't care where you write that, but you'll want to write that down. So one of the things that I'll do is you'll have practical quizzes you'll take in this chapter. And you'll have a picture. And if I have a star here and I ask you, what is that? You'd say, oh, that's the lumen. If I have an arrow pointing to this, you'd say, oh, that's the apical surface. If I have an arrow pointing to that, you would say that's the basement membrane. All right, so let's look at this one. This is the epithelial tissue here. So if this is the epithelial tissue, what do you think this structure is here? I'll pause a second to see if you can get it. The answer is this is the basement membrane. So if this is the basement membrane, what is this going to be? That is the apical surface. That means that this area out here would be the lumen. This is opening into the trachea, so the trachea would actually be our lumen. All right, finally, let's look at this bottom one. This lighter colored structure on, or darker colored structure on top is the epithelial tissue. So what does that make this? Oh, shoot, I did it again. Apologies, guys. What does that make this stuff down here? I have to be careful. I don't want to bring up my screen share. That's the basement membrane. So that means that this is the apical surface, and this would be the lumen. This is the lining of the bladder. And this is a specific, it's a different kind of, each one of these is a different kind of epithelial tissue. So our takeaways today are that there are 4 categories of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. We'll be doing 3 of the 4 in this chapter. Starting with epithelial, we have 4 functions, we have 2 locations, and we have 5 characteristics that are common for all epithelial tissues that you will need to know for the test. We'll talk about each of these, or at least I should say some of these, individually then when we get into the specific tissue types. All right, I'm going to stop sharing, and that is our video for today. Thanks for watching and have a great day.